Welcome back. Last time we looked at the eschatological discourse of Matthew's Gospel. In particular, we discussed the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, then turned to a summary of the discourse proper. This was followed by a look at the material Jesus presents on our response to the discourse, the necessity for watchfulness. In our current session, we shall look at three parables that follow on the eschatological discourse. The first is the parable of the 10 maidens, which emphasizes the necessity for readiness and preparedness. This will be followed by the parable of the talents, which emphasizes the need to take risks with what God has given us. We must be sharers, not hoarders. Finally, we shall examine the parable of the sheep and the goats, which provides a description of the last judgment and what will be required of us at that judgment. The 25th chapter of Matthew begins with a parable about a wedding. More particularly, a parable about the maidens who are to greet the wedding couple as the groom brings his intended bride from her home to his home for the wedding celebration. The parable begins simply connected to the preceding by the particle "τότε," or then, in Greek. The implication, drawn from the use of the future tense, is that this is at the time of the parousia, that is, the coming of Jesus, which is an unknown day and an unknown hour, as we've seen. The kingdom of heaven will be likened to the situation of 10 maidens at a wedding. The Greek word for maiden is parthenos. It generally refers to a maiden who is of marriable age. Thus, the further implication is that they are marriageable but not married, and hence virgins. These 10, for a particular wedding celebration, are charged with the task of welcoming the bridegroom and his entourage as he brings his future bride to his home for the marriage ceremony. They're equipped with oil lamps so as to light the groom's way if it becomes late. We're then told that 5 of them were foolish, morai. The adjective is akin to the English word moron, so you get the picture. The reason for their foolishness is then given. They took their lamps, but they did not take oil. It's similar to taking a flashlight with either dead or no batteries. In other words, their foolishness is derived from the fact that they were not prepared for their role in the wedding. The other 5 are described as wise, phronimai, which is an adjective that comes from the Greek noun phrein, which means brain. In other words, they used their brains. They took a sufficient amount of oil to fuel their torches. They were prepared for their role. A further note, given the eschatological background, that is the parousia, it seems likely and logical to equate the bridegroom in some sense with Jesus, who will have gone away, but is expected to return. The only other use of bridegroom in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew 9:15, actually makes this equation. A few words concerning wedding customs are appropriate at this point. In the culture of Jesus' day, females were considered as property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. This fact grounds many of the customs developed around weddings. There was a 2-step procedure, as there is in our society. The first step was known as betrothal. It was a time when the prospective couple would be promised to each other, but each would live in their family's homes. This could take place as early as an age at as early an age as 13 or 14. Some would parallel this to engagement, but there are significant differences. First, in an engagement, a boy would ask the girl to marry him, presenting her with a ring to show their engagement. If the situation changed, the engagement could be ended simply by returning the ring and ending it. In the first century world, families made the arrangements for young men and young women to marry. The individuals had very little to say in that choice. The betrothal, once agreed on, was as binding as the marriage. It could be dissolved only through a writ of divorce, similar to marriage. During the period of betrothal, a dowry was amassed, and the prospective husband would negotiate the price that he would pay to the father of the prospective bride. On the day of the marriage, the future husband would go to the house of the future bride, and the final negotiations would take place. These could be quick or could take a considerable amount of time. Meanwhile, the guests were gathering at the groom's home, waiting for the wedding ceremony. Once the negotiations were completed, the young man would bring his future wife to his home for the wedding. At the house of the husband, there would be young women or maidens whose sole task was to greet the couple and their entourage and light the way as they entered the house for the wedding. These are the maidens of this parable. All enter the house with the couple. The doors are closed and the marriage ceremony takes place. In the parable, then, there is a delay in negotiations, and hence a delay in the bridegroom bringing his bride for the wedding. As a result, the maidens grew tired, drowsy, and sleepy. Some even fell asleep. Many interpreters emphasize the uncertainty of the time of the groom's return, and hence emphasize the need for readiness. It is significantly late when the groom finally does arrive. In the middle of the night, there was a cry, "Behold the bridegroom, come out and meet him." They are roused to perform their function. Now, as they slept, their lamps were burning, and hence used up a significant amount of oil. The 10 maidens get up and begin to make the preparations, that is, trim their lamps. But those who forgot their oil, the foolish ones, realize the result of their forgetfulness. So they ask that the wise who brought sufficient oil give some of theirs to them. They have only the oil in their lamps, and that was very little, and their lamps were now going out. Some see a reference to Proverbs 13:9 here. The light of the just gives joy, but the lamp of the wicked goes out. The wise refuse, for fear that there not be enough, a sufficient amount for them and those who were asking. Many on this account fault the wise for this, as they should have been willing to share their oil. But their answer shows their prudence and their wisdom. Sharing may cause all the oil to be used. Then none of them could perform the task for which they were there. The situation is not one of generosity. Rather, it is one of being prepared. So they suggest that the foolish go to the store and buy the oil that they need. One might think that this would be nearly impossible, However, in a village where there was a wedding celebration, it would not be that difficult, as everything would center on that celebration. While they were away, the bridegroom arrives, and those who were prepared enter into the wedding and celebrate with him. The door is then closed. Then the foolish arrive, having procured their oil, and find the door closed. They knock and shout, "Lord, Lord, open for us." This recalls a saying of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount. Not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," will enter the kingdom of heaven. The answer from inside is, "Amen, I say to you." Notice the solemn introduction, "Amen, I say to you. I do not know you." Harrington notes that this is the equivalent of saying, "I'll now have nothing to do with you." So first they were rebuffed by the wise maidens. Now they're rebuffed by the keeper of the bridegroom's door. The moral of the parable follows. Watch, therefore, because you do not know the day nor the hour. Implied in the watch is be ready, be prepared, bring what's necessary to perform your role in the kingdom. Mackenzie sums it up well. He says, the parable restates yet again the uncertainty of the time of the parousia and recommends constant alertness, not the calculation of the signs of the times. A second parable on readiness is given by Jesus. This one is known as the parable of the talents. Many look at this parable of Jesus as talking about our abilities that we have been given by God. That's true, but primarily it's important to remember that a talent, as we saw earlier, is a monetary unit. In fact, a rather large monetary unit equivalent to 15 years' wages. This was not a coin that you would normally carry around in your pocket. Arnold recalls that a silver talent weighed approximately 75 pounds and had a value of 6,000 denarii. It therefore was worth approximately $247,200. With very little transition, Jesus moves from the maidens to the talents. It will be as a man having gone on a journey, calling his servants. Again, we're in the realm of a person on a journey. This time the emphasis falls on those who are left behind, the servants, to whom he handed over his property. This is similar to the apocalyptic discourse where the master put a faithful servant in charge of his household in Matthew 24:45. The word for property, hyparkonta, literally means the things that are at hand, the things present to a person. Hence, it means their possessions. Interpreters note two key themes appear in this parable: the departure or the absence of the Son of Man, the man on a journey, and the responsibility of those he leaves behind, the disciples. Then the exact allocation of the property is described. To one, he gave 5 talents. He would have needed a truck to carry them off. To another, he gave 2, a slightly smaller truck to carry them off. And to still another, he gave 1. The different amounts are then described as being given due to the varying abilities of each of the servants receiving them. Having apportioned his property now, he went away. Again, we have another wealthy householder. He has nearly $2 million. He's given out 8 talents. Multiply 247,200 by 8, and you see the amount. That's what he's given out. With that, the master has departed. It now falls on the servants, who have been made stewards of the master's goods, to step up and do what the master wants. In essence, he wants his stewards to utilize what he's given them to make more. Their compliance is immediate. The first, who has received 5 talents, goes out and does business with them and makes good, effective use of what has been given to him. In that, he doubles the master's investment in him. The Greek word used, ekedesen, derives from the noun meaning profit. Hence, he made a profit with the 5 talents. The second steward, similarly, he received 2 talents, is as industrious as the first, and makes a similar profit. He gained 2 more talents. He too made good use of the master's goods. The Greek particle de will signal that the third steward was not as industrious as the other 2. The one who received 1 talent goes out, digs a hole in the ground, and hid, that is, buried the treasure or the silver of his master. He seemingly was so cautious that he thought if he traded or did business with the talent, he would run the risk of losing it. And so he took the route of preserving it. There's no gain or profit, kerdos, only preservation in this instance. To give the servant or the steward his due, Jeremias, in his commentary on the parables, tells us that burying money was regarded as the best security against theft. Whoever buried money was free from liability, whereas whoever tied up entrusted money in a cloth was responsible for its loss. A considerable period of time, Paulin chronon, passes between the departure of the master and his return. That time, it is noted, was sufficient to allow the necessary business dealings to increase the talents. Upon his return, then, the master wishes to settle accounts. The very same process we saw in the parable of the unforgiving servant earlier in Matthew 18:23. This being the eschatological section of Matthew, the note of delay has drawn a parallel with the parousia, the return of Jesus. Thus, the accounting may be parallel to the judgment that all of us will face at the end. So the stewards are called in. The first to receive was the first to account. The one who received the 5 talents presented them proudly, announcing, "Master, you have handed me 5 talents. See, another 5 talents I have gained for you." He's made a 100% profit and presumably expects some reward. It's not long before he is rewarded. The master, elated, says to him, "Well done," would be better translated, "Well done," announcing that this is a good and faithful servant. Continuing the notion of faithfulness, he says, "You were faithful in a few things. Therefore, I will put you over many." Note the contrast of few, oliga, and many, polon. Recall that we're talking a total of over $2 million here. And that is a few things. What would the many be? The steward who was just presented the 10 talents then is invited to enter the joy of the master. The steward is showed that he has what it takes to live the lifestyle of the master. For the Christian, however, that joy would not be found in great material wealth, but rather in the blessings of heaven, which is the reward of a life well lived. That we would explain the few much contrast as heaven is so much more than we can imagine anything here on earth. Now the second steward approaches, the one who received 2 talents. He's made a similar profit, and we would expect that he would receive a similar reward. And we would be correct. Using the exact same language as the first, he announces that he had received two talents, and behold, now he returns 2 more. The master is duly pleased, and using the same formula as he did for the first servant, invites him to enter the joy of his master. As we saw in the account of the third steward, so now in his accounting, we're tipped off that something different will happen by means of the Greek particle de. So the third steward approaches, specified as the one who received the 1 talent. He's not as exuberant as the other 2. He begins his address almost apologetically. Having known you, he acted from his experience of the master previously, that you are a hard man. He then goes on to flesh out what a hard man means. Being a hard man, the third servant realizes concerning his master, he reaps where he did not sow, and he gathers where he did not scatter. The steward seems to have the correct estimation of the master. He wanted gain, which the stewards would make, as had occurred with the first 2 stewards. This preface then seems to be a justification for what he had done with the talent. But in reality, the steward seems only to be digging a deeper hole for himself. Then he admits that because of his estimation of the master, he was afraid to do anything with the talent for fear of losing it. And so he did the only thing he knew would preserve it. He hid it in the ground. Now he has it safe and sound and can return the property to his master. See now here what is yours. So it's clear that his motivation for action is fear. Fear of what the master might do if he loses the talent, which would then make him a failure. He searched for a way to preserve the talent and concluded that the best way to do that would be to bury it. The net result, however, is that there is no gain, no kerdos, except the fact that he's preserved the talent. And he can return it now to the master. He can't say, see, your talent has gained 1 more, or even a little more. He can only say, see, you have back what is yours. It goes without saying that the master is not pleased with the action of the third steward. Responding to his apparent justification of his actions, the master says, you evil and lazy servant. So he's not good and faithful. In fact, he's the exact opposite, evil and lazy. Then, using the very words that the servant used himself, he convicts him. You knew that I reap where I do not sow, and I gather where I do not scatter. This knowledge makes the situation of the steward all the more difficult. His justification has become rather his condemnation. Then the master tells him the minimum that he should have done. It was necessary that you put my silver in the bank. Tois trapezites. The master did not expect anything tremendously great. A simple deposit in the bank would have fulfilled the master's expectations for his talent from the servant. And upon his return, he could have received the talent back with interest, toko. Two words stand out in this, two words that are unique to the New Testament. The first is trapeza that we saw on the last slide, which is generally translated table. It comes to be a banker from the fact that the bankers, the money changers, and brokers sat at a table set up near the city gate or near the temple where they performed their tasks. Even to this day, a bank in Greece is known as a trapeza. The second unique word is tokos, which is generally translated interest. It derives from the Greek verb tikto, meaning to give birth. When one deposits money with the banker, it grows or it gives birth to more money. And that more money is what we call interest. Now, the interest gained at a bank may not be tremendously large, but it still remains a profit, kerdos, and as such, it's all that the master wished. But the servant is too scared to even do that. So now he gets what he tried to avoid, the wrath of the master. Take from him the talent, the master says, and give it to the one who has 10. This clearly illustrates the logion that will follow. To everyone who has, it shall be given, and it shall abound. It will be provided in abundance. The one with 5 talents made 5 more. Now he's given yet another to make a total of 11. But on the contrary, from the one who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. This is a repetition of the logion that appeared in the parables discourse in chapter 13, particularly at Matthew 13:12. As Hagner puts it, faithfulness provides more blessing. Unfaithfulness results in the loss even of one's initial blessings. But there is further punishment for this wicked and lazy servant. Now described as useless or worthless, the master commands that he be thrown out into the outer darkness. Where the other two were invited to enter, this servant is thrown out into the darkness. Then the favorite phrase of Matthew appears yet again, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Several scholars note that the darkness and the weeping and gnashing are favored metaphors of Matthew for the lot of the wicked. This servant is wicked, lazy, and useless. So what else would you expect? Placed at this point in the gospel, this parable clearly is a warning to Christians of all ages that diligent use of what God has given us is to be the norm. We cannot fall prey to laziness or fear. As Paul told the Corinthians, now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. To each then is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. 1 Corinthians 12:4 and 7. God has endowed us with gifts to be used for the good of all, not merely for our own good. That's what the first two servants did with their talents. They used it for the good of all. The third kept it for himself, his own good, hiding it so no one else could benefit from it. So where did it get him? Where are you with God's gifts to you? We come now to the third of these eschatological parables, a parable which, it can be said, marked the end of Jesus' public ministry in Matthew's Gospel, the sheep and the goats. It has also come to be known as the account of the Last Judgment. As we have seen in several places in Matthew to date, the end will be marked by a separation of good from evil. Now we find out exactly what are the criteria for that separation. Again, with no special introduction, Jesus launches into the parable. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him. This is a direct reference to the Old Testament book of Daniel, specifically Daniel 13:14. There, one like a son of man approaches the Ancient of Days, and receive from him dominion, power, and glory. Later writings saw that power and glory manifested by the Son of Man's role as a judge in the final days, the eschaton. See particularly the similitudes of Enoch. This is reminiscent of Matthew 16:27, where we saw the Son of Man coming in his Father's glory to repay everyone according to his conduct. Now, that's exactly what's going to occur in this parable. This is the final note concerning the coming of the Son of Man that we have heard of in past sessions. But the key is not the question of when, that is, at what time he will come. That was discussed in Matthew 24:3, but rather the significance of his coming, why he will come, and the correspondent need of those waiting for him to be prepared. Jesus then continues, "Then, when he returns, he will sit on his throne of glory, that is, his glorious throne, and all the nations, panta ta ethne, will gather before him for judgment." This is language drawn from the aforementioned similitudes of Enoch. Some scholars question what the exact meaning of all is here. Who is included? More specifically, would the Jews be included in the all? We find the exact same phrase in the Great Commission at the end of the Gospel, which most see as referring to all humanity, and it would be appropriate to interpret that phrase in a similar manner here. The division that is so characteristic of judgment parables now takes place. He will divide them from each other as a shepherd divides sheep from goats. Following the manner of a shepherd calling his sheep, the Son of Man will separate the righteous from the wicked. Note, sheep is a common metaphor for the people of God, that is, the righteous. The Son of Man will stand, therefore, with the sheep on his right, the place of honor, and the goats on his left. It is noted that the left is not usually a place of disfavor, but it seems so here from the context. Left is usually a position of lesser significance than the right. Then the king speaks first to the sheep, that is, those who are on his right. Note, the Son of Man introduced at the beginning of the parable has now become a king. Thus, we see here Jesus as a king in full glory, with no need for irony or secrecy, acting as an eschatological judge. He says, "Come, blessed ones of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." The invitation, come here, contrasts with the imperative, depart, that we will see later in 25:41 when the king addresses the goats. Further, the blessed, dieulogemenoi, contrast with the cursed or the accursed, the kataremenoi, again in the address to the goats. Thus, the terminology, blessed of my Father, denotes a special relationship, that is, those whom the Father speaks well of. The future of earlier treatments of the end of time has given way to the present. Come now, inherit now. Life has been lived. The reward is now. The reason is then given for their reward, designated by the Greek particle gar, meaning for or because. They have this inheritance because they did what was requested in what has come to be known as the corporal works of mercy. That is, they have fed the hungry, given drink to the thirsty, welcomed the stranger, clothed the naked, visited the sick and imprisoned, etc. The criteria for judgment is not how much or how often one prays. It's not how respected one is in the church assembly. It's not how much one knows. It is, rather, how well one ministered to the needs of their fellow human being. Note, the King, Son of Man, Jesus, says that they did these acts for him. When I was hungry, you gave me to eat. That will become crucial for the message of the parable. A bit shocked at this, the righteous will respond to him, questioning when they saw him hungry or thirsty, naked or a stranger, sick or imprisoned. Note, they repeat nearly verbatim the criteria that Jesus had set forth. These questions set up the crucial statement of the parable. The King, Son of Man, Jesus, responds to their inquiry, prefacing his response with the phrase that signals something is significant is about to be said. Amen, I say to you. As often as you did it to one of these my least brothers, you did it for me, or you did it to me. Recalling the very opening of the Hebrew Bible, the opening lines of the book of Genesis in particular, we note that humanity was made in the image and likeness of God. Jesus concludes that when they did one of these acts for one made in his image, they did it for him. Thus, he identifies himself with these little ones. Having given the criteria and the reward in regard to the righteous, he moves to the other side, to the unrighteous on his left. Instead of inviting them to come, he commands that they go. Depart from me, he says. They're not called blessed, rather they're accursed. And they have not a kingdom to inherit, rather they're consigned to eternal fire. Recall throughout the gospel that fire has been a symbol of judgment. So they are reaping the reward of their actions. As with the righteous, the reason is given for them, repeating yet for a third time the things that make for salvation, noting that when they failed to act on behalf of God's image, they failed to act for God. I was hungry, and you did not give me to eat, etc., etc., etc. They, the accursed, will then answer Jesus, addressing him as Lord, Kuria, and question, when they saw him hungry, thirsty, naked, a stranger, sick, or in prison, and did not minister to him. It's almost as if they were saying, well, if we knew it was you, of course we would have helped. The question and the surprise is similar to the reaction of the righteous, but that won't help them in the end. Then Jesus, the King, the Son of Man, will answer them, reiterating the very principle that he set forth earlier for the righteous. Again, he begins with the solemn statement of introduction, Amen, I say to you. As often as you did not do it for one of these least ones, you did not do it for me. The only difference here is the principle is stated in a negative form rather than a positive one. The effect of the repetition is to drive home the fact that our lives here on earth will be judged on how we treat our fellow human being. Do we treat them as though they were Christ or not? That principle animated the rule of St. Benedict in his monasteries, and it drove the ministry of Mother Teresa among the poorest of the poor. It must also be the driving force and raison d'etre of each of us in our lives. The parable concludes then with the cursed departing to their reward, eternal punishment, which is described as kolasis. This is normally a punishment aimed at rehabilitating the offender. However, here, when it's modified by the adjective eternal, it would seem that it's a punishment without end, meted out on those who choose to live a life separated from Christ, and thus will remain separated from him through all eternity. There seems to be no rehabilitation here. The just, or the righteous, depart into eternal life. They recognize Christ, remained with him on earth, and now are to be with him in eternity. Both the reward of the righteous and the punishment of the accursed are eternal. We've gone a little bit over time today, but it was important that we see these three parables together. Next time, we'll look at the Last Supper and the Passion narrative as Matthew presents it. See you then.